everybody. Welcome to the CLEAR webinar series. This is Emily Wilson talking from our CLEAR office in Haddam, Connecticut in the Middlesex County Extension Office. Welcome to our fourth presentation in our series this year called Loss of Carbon Sequestration from Land Use Change. I'd like to highlight some other webinars coming forward here. We have one about LIDAR on October 28th. One about roads and your high blood pressure on November 18th, and one about the Natural Resources Conservation Academy on December 19th. All of these webinars, the ones that have already been conducted, listed in gray there, have been recorded and are available on the CLEAR website. And we are also recording this webinar, which we will post in a couple of days. Okay, first to start out, we are part of the center, or I am part of the Center for Land Use Education and Research called CLEAR at the University of Connecticut. We focus on three main topic areas: land use and climate, resilience, and water and geospatial technologies. So the mission of CLEAR is to provide information, education, and assistance to land use decision makers in support of balancing growth and natural resource protection. We are also going to be talking at the end about CT Eco, Connecticut Environmental Conditions Online, which is a website that is a partnership between us at CLEAR and the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, or DEEP. The CT Eco website is a place where all sorts of geospatial and map information is shared with the public. And some maps coming out of this research are some of the newest additions. So we will talk more about CT Eco at the end. Okay, just to give you a little background about this work, Linda Tomaso will be doing most of the talking today, and she will introduce herself in a minute. But just to explain how we came to this place, in the summer of 2012, she was a seasonal intern at DEEP in the Bureau of Technology and Energy Policy. And then in August of 2012, she came to visit us at CLEAR, and we realized the relationship between the land cover data sets that we have and develop here and the DEEP triennial greenhouse gas inventory and the potential there. So in August of 2013, this work became part of the CT Eco work plan. At the same time, Linda was pursuing her graduate degree and really looking into all of this information. In February of this year, she finished and she won the Dean's Thesis Prize because the work was so outstanding. And after that, we started applying that to our land cover to make some maps. So we're going to go over some of that work here today. So first, she's going to get going and explain all of this, and that will be most of the next hour. And then at the end, I will show some of the maps and information that's available on CT Eco, and then we will have time for any questions or discussions. So with that, let me turn it over here to Linda. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. And I'd like to thank Chet, Arnold, David Dixon behind the scenes, and everyone at DEEP as well who's helped me put this work together. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for everyone listening out there. The work that I've done began, as Emily mentioned, when I was seasonal at DEEP, and it occurred to me that there's an opportunity here to marry the land work mapping that is going on in this office with some of the climate change policy needs that are being pursued at the state level. So I will walk you through my thesis. This is me. I'm currently an environmental policy researcher at the Center for Health and the Global Environment at the at the Harvard School of Public Health. And I'm doing a continuation of this research on the application of China's urbanization and what land change means in a rapidly urbanizing environment with high carbon emissions as a background. Just some preliminaries so that we're all on the same page. We all know, and we couldn't have picked a better day to do this webinar months ago. We did not know that there would be a climate change gathering in New York that would have the groundswell of public support as it had this past weekend. We also didn't know it would be the first day of fall. So to combine the background interest in climate change and what you're seeing all over the newspapers today and during the week, as well as the beautiful weather outside, makes it the perfect day to discuss the change in land change and forest cover in the light of climate change issues. So looking here, this is the really most probably critical measurement of carbon dioxide rise in the atmosphere. And it is an American scientist by the name of Charles Keeling who began taking measurements of atmospheric carbon dioxide in 1958 at a research point in Hawaii. And so across 50 years, this is really shows the incontrovertible trend upward of rising carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Doing quick calculations, we're now at 397 parts per million by volume, which it's estimated to avoid any type of change in the environment that would be less than 2 degrees Celsius, we would have to remain at 350. So clearly we're pushing 400. We hit that in April, and it'll be very difficult with the persistence of carbon dioxide to bring this down unless some drastic measurements are taken. EPA has a really great visual metaphor for talking about the sources and sinks that contribute to carbon balances. And so while we're talking about carbon, atmospheric carbon, too much attention, I think, is given to the emission side of it, and very little is talking about the sink removal, other than large-scale deforestation in the Amazon. But of course, removing our sinks is very much akin to the drain of a bathtub. So EPA's metaphor is of the bathtub. If you were to keep your faucet on, which is the equivalent of the carbon emissions, and not let your drain run, pretty much you would have your bathtub overflowing. So it's the same thing when you're looking at carbon in the atmosphere. We've turned on our faucet, but at the same time, and we're adding to that by deforestation, but at the same time, we're plugging up our drain because both ocean uptake is reaching a point of full saturation with the acidification of the oceans, but also the land uptake by vegetative biomass is being arrested with piecemeal and incremental type of forest loss as we have here in Connecticut. So I think this presentation is very important because it focuses on that sink removal portion and how we can restore those for their full value. Otherwise, we're looking at a double negative when we start to look at the inventorying. We add emissions to the sources, but by removing the sinks, we've converted our negative to a positive. Another way of looking at it is this is, again, NASA's full estimation. We're looking at about 9 picograms of carbon that are entering the atmosphere in any given year. And the quadrant at the left are our emissions, predominantly from burning fossil fuels, but also from deforestation and the release of carbon into the atmosphere. But if you look at the right, you have almost 30% of the various sinks. Well, if we look at oceans and land principally, but about 30% being absorption by land uptake. And so this has a wide degree of wide parameters and wide margin of error here, which could be anywhere from really 14 to 40%. So this emphasizes the importance of the land uptake when we start to look at the whole carbon flows into the atmosphere, in and out of the atmosphere, excuse me. Okay, again, just this is an oversimplification, and it's my own of carbon sinks, or I should say the carbon cycling here, but it's very important that we focus, I think, on the 4 carbon stocks that make up the forest ecosystem, and that this is where we're concentrating our research today. So again, through photosynthetic processes, we have carbon dioxide being absorbed by the trees. Some autotrophic respiration is releasing carbon dioxide into the air, but principally it's exuding oxygen and picking up the carbon. This would be the above ground biomass stock, which is what we're used to discussing or thinking about when we think of photosynthesis. We think of leaves, and then move on to the branches, we move on the trunks, and the higher and denser the biomass, of course, the higher the uptake of the carbon. Second carbon stock we're looking at is the falling of the dead leaf litter and the dead wood, which comprises really the forest floor, and that's the second carbon stock. And as that decomposes, turning into the type of humus that becomes eventually part of the soil organic carbon. A third source in the root systems, and so the below ground biomass is probably one of the 4 stocks that receives the least research attention, partly because of its difficulty in measuring and gauging changes to that and conducting research below ground. But the root mortality converts it again into the soil organic carbon stock, but this is the third thing we're looking at here. It's also worth mentioning that in an area of southern New England where Connecticut is positioned, it's estimated that the above ground biomass to the below ground biomass has a ratio of 1 to 0.46. So that's the number that I used in my calculations. And of course, the 4th carbon pool is the soil itself, so soil organic carbon, exuding some by soil respiration, but predominantly remaining. as the fourth carbon stock of interest. When I was back at DEEP, I assisted in putting together the it would be the 2012 greenhouse gas inventory based on 2010 climate data. What came out here is that it was, again, emissions centric without a portion that was attributed to the carbon sink. It struck me as a little inconsistent, seeing that we are not here in Connecticut a heavy agricultural state, so it wouldn't make sense that we would have our land use depicted as a carbon source rather than the sink. And so this is a chart that actually is from the DEEP website on climate change. And so what it shows is that from the initial period of beginning the inventorying in 1990 up until the year 1997, you have your land use change and forestry in particular, the carbon forest flux, represented as a carbon sink in the tune of 4.2 million metric tons. There is what appears to be a methodological error, or change at least, less an error than a change that brings that consistently to a source at the level of 4.5 million metric tons. So that's a 9 million metric ton gross change in this. It has since apparently come back to being a sink. And so when you look at land use, without a consistent and reliable tally of the carbon fluxes, this was set aside till a better methodology could be discovered, other than the state inventory tool module that's provided by the EPA. So I started to think, if terrestrial carbon sequestration in the form of biomass could be evaluated based on data that we would have and whatever might be available in the way of land mapping, as is done with the RED program overseas, I was thinking that perhaps there'd be a two-step methodology that would prove the effectiveness of carbon sequestration through land-based biomass in terms of an effective carbon reduction policy tool that could be both cost-effective as well as scientifically proven to be effective. And by looking at this, I wanted to look on a dollar per dollar basis. Is this something states could consider as an instrument to reduce carbon emissions? I'm going to give you the conclusions of my thesis very, very briefly, so that you can see where I'm going with this presentation, because at certain points it becomes sort of data heavy, but you could see where we're pointed to in this research. The fact that I found at the end is that the ratio of forest loss in the state of Connecticut to the ratio of carbon sequestration would be 1 to 4.62, so really almost a 1-to-5 ratio, due to conversion of forest lands from high to low carbon densities. So moving those forest areas principally into development and to the land cover types like grass and turf grass that accompany development. Secondly, the cost of this, so that the dollars invested in carbon reduction through land preservation and protection and other zonings could create a better yield than many policies that are currently offered and being pursued at the state and regional government level. Thirdly is that the demographic trends in the state of Connecticut and New England generally offer really once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to capture these small forest tracts in order that they become vehicles of preservation of these natural carbon sinks. I'm going to walk you through a number of charts that help explain the situation here. Connecticut's forest loss historically has been the steepest in all of New England. If you see from the left of the chart, try and work a little bit with the arrow here. Okay, so from the point of settlement, colonial settlement, all the way to just after the Civil War, you have Connecticut as a percentage experiencing the largest percentage of forest loss of any of the 6 New England states. This reverses itself with the trend of agricultural abandonment and moving to the west till about 1950. And you have a trend after the Second World War of starting out with initial suburbanization. And from 1950, but particularly 1970 forward, you see that Connecticut, again, with that dark green line, has resumed its dubious but preeminent position as the state with the largest forest loss in New England. Okay, looking at some of the facts surrounding Connecticut's forest loss and this forest land conversion is that first we said that we have the steepest rate of forest loss vis-a-vis our neighboring New England states over the last 40 years. Secondly, 20% of these are classified as urban forests. So those are forests that would be found in municipal parks, which are found, believe it or not, in the city cores of Connecticut cities, Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, Waterbury. And so that's where you found those. Sometimes they're found on other municipal areas like golf courses, but 20% is quite significant in that. Half of these forests are within 100 yards of either hard development or agricultural lands. And so this subjects them to certain types of stresses, such as wind effects, types of development that would come, or I should say invasive species that would come from development in gardening. You would also have fertilizers that would be blowing off the agricultural land. So it makes the rims of these forests in the Arctic cores highly susceptible to damage and loss of productivity. Also, certain areas of our state, New London County, because of its scenic beauty, obviously on the Sound and headed toward Rhode Island, are predicted to lose about half, anywhere from 40 to 63% additional forest land to conversion and development over the next 15 to 20 years. Driving all of these changes is low density housing development. So we're talking only 6 to 25 homes per square kilometer. And this across New England is the fastest growing driver of land change. I'll start you with the photo on the right. Actually, this is really a photo that's a spoof, but it appears in the Woodlands and Wildlands publication of Harvard Forest, and the caption on this is development outside Hartford, Connecticut. And that shows that low density type of development. And if you look at the upper corners of the photo, you see that this would have likely have been some type of clear-cut development because the forests are depicted in those upper and right corners. If you were to contrast the land conversion and the consumption of land in the right bar, I should say the right trend line to the graph at the left, and then which comes to well over 100% over the last 30 years, and this was measured up to 2003. Sorry that I don't have more recent data on that. But compare it to the only 14% population growth for the state of Connecticut over that same period. So what you see here, and if you contrast it to the photo on the right, what you see is increasing disparity between population growth and land consumption for the state of Connecticut. And this is not typical of other states. It's definitely not typical of the western states. They're more heavily forested, but at the same time, they have confined their development through different fiscal and then planning tools. My research objectives were 6 in proposing a new methodology for accounting for change, land use change in forestry, in order to apply them to carbon accounting. The first thing would be to assign carbon sink values to all of the 12 classes of Connecticut's biomass. There's 28 classes in total, and 12 of them appear in the state, so each of them has to have its own particular carbon stock value for each, or carbon density value for each of the 4 carbon stocks. Secondly, I was looking to determine rates of carbon sink loss across time, so not captured as any point, but as a trend. Thirdly, compare those rates of sink loss to your larger GHG emissions profiles. So you have trend lines that are both increasing with emissions, or Connecticut has done really a remarkable job over the past 10 years, capping those to about 40 million metric tons for fossil fuel emissions, but looking against the long-term rates of carbon capture and carbon loss of carbon capture through land change. Fourthly, I'm looking to monetize this sink value in terms of a unit of analysis, of comparative analysis, which would be dollars per ton of CO2. 5, I want to see what might be the limiting conditions to see where this methodology could or could not apply for other areas of interest. And 6, what are the broader environmental and policy applications in looking to make this actionable in terms of research. Please bear with me, this is not the most interesting part, but I just want to show you how the method was applied here and my methodological design in order to come up with my conclusions. First of all, there is a program a computer program out of Stanford University and the Natural Capital Project called the InVEST, Integrated Valuation of Environmental Services and Trade-offs. They have a carbon storage and sequestration model, which is what I use to simulate the carbon capture through this land use change. It requires two sets of input data. So it's a set of land use land cover maps. And fortunately, we have them right here from CLEAR at UConn. To the best of my knowledge, and I heard this from the Natural Capital Project, that no state short of Connecticut has 25 years of consistent, reliable land use data. And so while it has been applied to many uses here out of CLEAR offices, to the credit of all those who have both pioneered the methodology but continued to provide this to the public, this is really important because Connecticut stands unique in this. And so we would hate to lose the continuity of this data for what it means now for climate applications. Secondly, the carbon pool valuations. So there's 4 carbon pools for each of the carbon the types of land cover categories: above ground, below ground, biomasses, carbon in the soil, and then the dead organic matter. And these all came out of literature searches. So the first set of data is the clear raster data, which is on the left. So you have your 12 land use categories, and then in terms of area coverage and what this means in terms of percent change vis-a-vis one another, each other's categories. And so you have a forest cover change overall for the 25 years coming to 3.83%. So figure almost 4%. And the land use map on the right is something familiar to all of us from the CLEAR website. Looking at those 25 years of change in a mapped form, I grouped roughly, not in terms of calculations, but just in terms of visualizing the change. I put developed, turf grass, and barren land together because these are the ones that usually accompany in terms of development. You usually have, if it's suburban development, you're going to have lawns to accompany that. Abandoned development is going to be the barren land. And so both the forests and coniferous forests together are shown in green, and then to a lesser extent the croplands and the grasslands and the waterways. So you see an expansion obviously along the corridor of Fairfield County, and then across the 25 years you've seen the expansion along the Connecticut River Valley heading up north, as well as the Thames River, and then along the coastline here. So it's easy to visualize that there have been land changes here in Connecticut to the detriment of our forest lands. Here's the matrix of carbon stock values that are the 4 carbon stock categories for each of the 12 land cover categories. I had been asked where to find this chart, and to be honest, this is the really foundation of the thesis research, and really over between 100 and I'd say 80 and 100 scientific articles were grabbed in order to come up with values that are both conservative, so as not to overestimate my carbon sequestration numbers, but also that were specific to southern New England. So I think the only exception to this, I would say all of these all of the carbon density values are within, I would say, 50 to 100 miles. Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island forming the main basis, no farther north than southern New Hampshire. The only exception to this is the tidal wetlands, and it just shows that more research, particularly when you look at the carbon stock value of wetland soils being so disproportionately large to the other categories, just points to the fact that more research needs to be done on this very important carbon stock. The main, out of this 180 to 100 articles, really my main and most reliable source came from the USDA, and it's a publication called Forests of Southern New England from 2011. I think their data was from 2007. And so these are the most abundant forest species represented here in Connecticut. But again, I didn't average them out because obviously each of these species compositions appears in different proportions. So everything was very specific. So foresters out there, you could let me know, you would know better than I at the moment off the top of my head how much maple, beech, and birch might have represented. But that was what I calculated in terms of a combined carbon stock of over 200 micrograms per hectare, then was multiplied by the percentage of land cover represented by that species. So I tried to get this both accurate, local, and conservative. Here's a sample window from my carbon sequestration model. It just shows you, this is just a sample, my input from 2006, my output would be from 2010, and I'm combining with carbon pools that are specific to that period. This is an output window from the InVEST model. So with each of these, I could find my current and future scenario carbons. The sequestered carbon uniformly came out negative across each of these intervals that were sensed by CLEAR. Now, knowing that this has no biomass growth behind the calculations, and that is one of the pitfalls of the InVEST model, it only does perform static modeling. So this would be with no accounting for biomass growth, and we know that that's not true either. But just to look at a straight trajectory of carbon loss, here are my numbers on the left of what was plotted and spit out by the model. And so you're showing an absolute, not cumulative, but an absolute loss by 2010, starting over the 25-year period of over 38 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. Coincidentally, for 2010, Connecticut's total fossil fuel emissions, which are 90% of the greenhouse gas emissions, came out to 38 and change million metric tons. So one could say here, without accounting for biomass growth, the loss of carbon sequestration was the entirety of the state of Connecticut's fossil fuel emissions. It's pretty sobering. But at the same time, recognizing that we do have biomass growth and recognizing that there's a good margin and possibility of error here, either in both the sensing of the underlying carbon stocks, estimations of growth, biomass growth, and then any of my work. So we put in some sensitivity analysis here that would both look in this one at the underlying carbon stocks. So you have 3.0 megagrams of carbon per hectare annualized for coniferous forest growth and 2.5 for deciduous forest growth. That's our baseline. And then we have plus and minus 10% and plus and minus 40%. So I modeled all of those to account for error. I likewise did the same thing for the deciduous and coniferous forest stocks, the 4 carbon stocks, and then put those into models. This is some of the output data here that you could see the carbon stock 10 and plus and minus 10% for each of the coniferous and deciduous forest stocks, which are the main drivers of my carbon modeling. And then the combined one, plus and minus, which are your outermost parameters here. If you look at deciduous and you see this dip that goes up initially from 85 to the early 90s and then back up before assuming a linear trajectory, this accounts for the fact that these were very strong economic years for the country at large, but particularly for New England's housing market. And so this would have been periods of much larger than normal increases or expansion of housing development in Connecticut. And so that shows in almost all cases is really this dip and then a linear recovery of development there. So putting these all together, we have sequestration output that does account for biomass growth in the modeling. What we do see is your highest level up until really 25 years when it crosses over is that 10% sort of overestimation of the combined or variation from baseline of deciduous and carbon coniferous forest stocks is the driving value and the most important of all your stocks, all the parameters. The 40% above baseline, which is a really large margin of error, eventually takes that over. But again, that should be taken with a little bit of grain of salt. And here are the numbers to prove that out. So we're looking at sequestration levels really about 1,200 million metric tons annually from Connecticut's forest cover classes. I'm sorry, all vegetated cover classes. Okay, so what happens here is that at a certain point I realized if you're going to have carbon sequestered with biomass growth and land change, what might have happened if there were no change to the land cover classes? What would the sequestration have looked like across those 25 years had extensive, particularly housing development or low density housing development not have occurred? So I remodeled all of this with the original 1985 land cover classes that CLEAR produced. And then what you did see, quite honestly, was a significant difference. So my baseline before accounting for some of the sensitivity analyses is that you had a sequestration difference in the amount of 53, almost 54 million metric tons of carbon. Bear in mind, again, that Connecticut's total fossil fuel emissions is 40 million metric tons on average, I think 38 this last round. That represents almost an 18% change, or I should say 18% amount of foregone sequestration over this period. All right, again, so I'm asking if this was sequestered with forest loss, how would you account for what had been captured without the change? So again, I'll show you how I did the calculations down here. Right above is the amount of foregone sequestration. Here's your percentage, and here are your parameters. They range from really 15 to 22%. This is the equation that I used. I took the amount of foregone sequestration as modeled, subtracted what was actually sequestered, and then dividing it over the foregone sequestration. That's where I came up with the 18%, okay? Right there. All right, now this is the revelatory comparison of data. So again, going back to what CLEAR showed us for the forest cover change from the data sets, we're looking at 3.83% forest cover loss over the 25-year period, which comes out to 17.68% as a baseline, which in terms of a ratio is 4.62 times what we're losing in carbon sequestration compared to what we're losing in actual forest cover. And you could see that over time, this would be increasing. How does this compare to Connecticut's emissions? As we say, basically you have Connecticut's fossil fuel emissions, CO2 emissions that are hovering about 40 million metric tons. You see that the carbon sequestration begins at 0, 1985, and with this asymptotic curve, it rises each year. 2003, more or less, 2004, they would have narrowed right there, and then from that point forward, foregone sequestration clearly surpasses the amount of actual emissions. There's another way of graphing it. This would be foregone sequestration, and that would have risen even as the level of emissions would remain more or less the same. Okay, this is a point to stop for questions. Emily?
Okay, we have a question here. So you can develop a cost per acre for development, whereby a taxing authority could assess a fee on a developer who permanently destroys a plat for development purposes. The resulting fund could provide resources for other mitigation. So it's more of a statement.
Okay. The second half of my presentation, the second really quarter, goes into some of the financial analysis, but I'm not disagreeing with your point. The question is if you would want to look at the amount of tons that would be sequestered through the application of those funds that were used on taxed properties or developers being taxed, and how that fund necessarily would have to be set up in order to go directly into a mitigation fund, which I don't believe exists at the moment. So what you would have to do is set that up first, and then over time you would have to come up with a compensatory amount of sequestration in terms of another vehicle that's set up. And so I do have at the very end, if you're interested, some actual development projects that have been modeled, and I can show you and you can see what comes out to. I actually think it would not level out, to be honest.
Okay. Are there any other questions? That's all I have right now. Just to remind you, you have a question box as part of your webinar software, that little orange arrow on your screen. So you can open that up and type a question in, and we can answer them as we go. Okay?
Okay, great. Thanks, Emily. Okay, again, at this point, it remains at the level of research, so I wanted to apply it to actual open space parcels. So I turned to my hometown of Farmington, Connecticut, and the town land planning office was very helpful in providing me some of the data on open space parcels that have been conserved over the past, up to 40, 50 years. And so we were actually able to model this data with the land cover carbon stocks to look at actually sized pieces and knowing what had been paid for them. So we selected of the 7 or 8 parcels that were available, 4 that had different types of land cover schematics here. So on the upper left, you have Burnt Hill Farm, which is predominantly a forested parcel, which has some wetlands in the middle, but is intersected by a utility corridor. This on the right, Hind Farm, is an historic working farm. So this was preserved with the idea of preserving the historic character that Farmington, Connecticut, by its very name, you can imagine, represents. And so these are agricultural plots, both here, and they're dissected by deciduous, and the dark green is coniferous forests. In the lower left, this is a most recent acquisition by the town, Krell Farm, and it offers the largest variety of land cover classes within the one property. So the green continues to be forest lands, but the white blocks represent the hard structures. So both the farmhouses, the barns, the garden, the farm stand, and then as well as you have some wetlands and some agriculture plots, and even the yellow tends to be turf grass. So that's probably lawn somewhere. And then Saddle Ridge over here to the right is 100% forest. So that'll give us a really good contrast among the four properties. I will walk you through this very quickly. So with these four properties, we have known acreage. And so I use the bookends of CLEAR's earliest land category, sensing data, and with their latest from 2010. So we know what the acreage is. And because the unit of analysis is megagrams of carbon per hectare, so I convert it right away into hectares. Using my arrow. Okay, so we go from acres to hectares. And then we know by running the InVEST model what are total megagrams of carbon that are captured at these 2 points in time for each of the four properties. So then from there, I divide the megagrams of carbon by the hectare acreage. And to come up with a unit of megagrams of carbon per hectare that have been sequestered, making the transition. Don't forget that this is carbon that's sequestered, but what is its equivalent amount in carbon dioxide that is emitted? So you multiply that by the 3.664 multiple, which is the atomic weight, of carbon dioxide. So then you have that different multiple. So you have megagrams of carbon dioxide, which is the same of megatons of carbon dioxide. The historic purchase price for open space in Farmington, that this is average, but it is $25,000. So at least it gives us, again, a consistent denominator here. So if we're looking at converting it into dollars per hectare, dollars from per acre into dollars per hectare, then from there, a little cross multiplication, we end up with dollars per megagram of carbon. Again, dollars per megatons of carbon, metric tons of carbon, pardon me. And so we end up with a final price here of dollars per metric tons of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere. We see that the Hind Farm, as you saw above, is predominantly agricultural. So that is agricultural land will have the lowest carbon density. That ends up yielding a price per carbon sequestered that's the highest of the four properties. In the meantime, Saddle Ridge at the very bottom was 100% forested. So even at its most expensive, it was $65 and almost $66 per ton of carbon dioxide removed. And then it dips below $50 per ton by 2010. Obviously, over time, that number would continue to fall. So how does carbon sequestration in terms of forest conservation or preservation of open space compare with alternative vehicles of carbon abatement that are being pursued around the country at this point, as really around North America at that point? So this is not an evaluative comment. This is just one that compares numbers here. So some of the transit modification policies, this is one to lower the amount of vehicle miles traveled on the roads by moving people from private vehicles into mass transit. And so we have different estimations here, high of over 4,000 to just under 1,000. Victoria Policy Institute is a well-known transportation policy think tank, and so they come up with these numbers. The Connecticut Fast Track probably comes between, I think it's $3,200 or $3,400 per ton of carbon dioxide. Granted, there are many other benefits, and I'm all in favor of transit, so I'm not making, again, an evaluative commentary on that. I'm just saying that if you were only to look at the carbon benefits, this is what some of the cost would be. The bus rapid transit systems vary widely. very widely. So in Los Angeles, what they did is dedicated an existing lane and sort of painted a double line there. And so you have $117 to put a fast track bus system in. But in Vancouver, where they actually have to build, just like we're building the fast track here in Connecticut. So CT fast track, you have something over $3,000 per ton of carbon dioxide. Road improvements, again, infrastructure costs are always going to be the largest sort of carbon diversion and reduction. Concentrated solar, but again, sun-rich locations. I doubt if Connecticut would qualify as one of those year-round. And nuclear competitive, that's just the operational price of nuclear energy. That's not looking at the facilities construction and planning. The latest RGGI auction 25 clearing price was just under $5, so that is an uptick over past auction prices. But again, it's a long-term reduction, but it's actually not carbon removal on the spot from the atmosphere, whereas forest preservation can claim to do that. So you can see, given this range of carbon abatement costs, that forest preservation for the purposes of affecting climate change and of mitigating the emissions is a very respectable, cost-effective strategy. What are some of the policy implications when we start to apply this research and to how we could better conserve forest land if it is for the purpose of looking at our climate change and lowering our overall emissions budget? First of all, is that Public Act 490 is our major, really our centerpiece tax incentive programs to assist Connecticut forest landowners with preservation of those forests. The only thing is that it has a minimum, it applies to a minimum of 25 acres of ownership, whereas here in Connecticut, the average holding is only 9 to 10 acres. So the majority of landholders here in Connecticut cannot benefit from this legislative tax incentive program. Secondly, is that if you look at the demographics of New England, but particularly here in Connecticut, you have of the half of total privately owned forests, 70% of owners, really, so I guess 35% of all owners here in the state of Connecticut are over the age of 50. And so as they begin to retire and to move south for warmer climates and sort of lower tax states, to Florida or Texas, you're going to have large generational change in long-term land ownership, meaning that these 10-acre parcels are ideal to be sold into development because from there you could get 9, 10 or more plots to be developed. So this is the iconic type of forest land conversion into development that we've been seeing over the past 20 years. Thirdly, what we need to know is the forests that will be taken down for this piecemeal development are of the 80 to 100-year-old tree stands. And so this is the stands of highest carbon density here. So this is exactly what we would be coming down. So it's not just in terms of coverage and acreage, it's terms of highest carbon density, which is worrisome. If I were to make policy recommendations from this research, it would be, first of all, to broaden the criteria for which the state looks at public land acquisition and provides grants for doing so. We currently do have some environmental aims, biodiversity, obviously, and watershed protection, but traditionally it's been for recreational access. So those parcels of insular forest land that are not easily attainable from or accessible from the street or by users tend to be bypassed for some others. So perhaps it's time to start looking at these for climate reduction goals. I should say carbon reduction for the purpose of achieving our legislated climate goals. Secondly, RGGI, which is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, to which Connecticut and the 6 New England states belong, caps its offset allowances at 3% for forest preservation. We could be raising this cap on our compliance obligations. California's is currently 8%, and so California has reached outside the state in order to meet these obligations by purchasing a very large forest tract in Maine. Connecticut could consider packaging some of its own forests in terms of compliance, meeting compliance obligations for other states and selling those rights. Thirdly, fiscal policies are directed obviously to public land holdings. So while we have the majority of forest lands that are owned both by private landholders and by conservation NGOs such as forest and other land trusts, we could be engaging them in partnerships with incentives toward reaching our climate goals. Connecticut, again, is not a state that has heavy public ownership like the states out west, specifically the Pacific Northwest. So it's time that we broaden our scope of protection here in partnership. And then finally, zoning and development and redevelopment is a prime vehicle for expanding opportunities for protection and for concentrated development in order to avoid deforestation before, in fact, these become permanent hardscapes and then become irrecoverable. So again, I repeat the main conclusion that draws from the research in terms of Connecticut's climate policies, so that the estimates of foregone sequestration from previous forest lands that have now been converted to development would have yielded almost 54 million metric tons of carbon dioxide of additional sequestration over the 1200 current, meaning that it would have surpassed the total annual fossil fuel emissions from 2002 forward. Secondly, the preservation of these stocks over time is the most important determinant. And so rather looking at rates of growth, we have to look at the underlying forest preservation, which then allows growth as additive on top of that. And thirdly, that avoided deforestation through any type of land conservation and preservation vehicles, together with more focused development and regional redevelopment and regional development planning, can reduce carbon levels, and this could become a much more cost-effective way of pursuing our carbon reduction strategies in order to meet our climate goals for the state and beyond. This research, at least the first part of the research, the methodology, is forthcoming in the Journal of Environmental Protection. The article has been approved for a special issue on land use and sustainability, and this GIS methodology proposal, as it applies to Connecticut, is the subject of this paper. And finally, I want to thank Chet Arnold, Emily Wilson, David Dixon here, the audience, and my deep collaborators, together with several other entities, institutions, and people who, without whose help of a single one of them, I never could have realized this research. So I mean that most sincerely. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Okay, we have a couple of questions. I've been asked to let the audience know that the DEEP's latest greenhouse gas emissions report is available at this website, ctclimatechange.com. In a minute, I'm going to show you the CT Eco web pages, and I will link to that report from those web pages if you did not get that address, ctclimatechange.com. Another question was if this report was available online. I assume it's that report I just mentioned. If not, Linda said, we said that this presentation will be online, and if we missed what report that is, let me know, and we will link to it from the CT Eco web pages. Okay, here's another statement. If you're going to compare forest sequestration with emissions prevented through bus rapid transit projects, you should acknowledge that BRT actively encourages dense development and reduces development pressure on forest land.
That's an excellent point. You're right. Not looking at it in terms of explanation by that, but any transit-oriented development absolutely concentrates the development. So that's exactly what we're trying to look at. Redevelopment of core cities and the transit hubs concentrates residential development as well as commercial development and takes the pressure off. So I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you.
Okay, and we don't have any other questions right now, so I'm going to slip back to a couple of other slides here. And just sort of stress what I'm going to show you in the maps here in a second. So this is the table that Linda showed you in her slides just a minute ago, these numbers. And what we did for the maps is we applied these the carbon total coefficient essentially and applied it to the land cover. Now I'll say that the numbers that are mapped are slightly different because of the unit conversion. But in general, the darker the red areas, the more carbon stock or potential sequestration, if I have the terms right, that's Linda's working with me, and the lighter colors are less so. And then just to point out what the change map will show you, and this is different from other land cover change maps that we've looked at before, because the carbon numbers are different. So I highlight in the case if you have, these are the from classes, and these are the 2 classes. So any change from forest to something else is going to be a loss in potential. See, these are mostly negative numbers, except for tidal wetlands. At the same time, any change from anything else to forest is going to be an increase in potential. So this is just the same point that she just made. Also, any change from any class 2 developed is going to be a loss in potential due to the hardened scape, as she said. And finally, in the yellow, I want to point out that turf grass is an interesting case because in terms of carbon, it has a relatively higher ability to sequester. So some changes, like from grass and fields to turf and grass, actually show an increased ability to sequester carbon. So with that, let me take you to the maps. Okay, so this is an interactive map that you can get to from the CT Eco web pages, which I'll show you in a second. When we open this map up, the first thing that is turned on are the 2010 values. And so as you can see, as I mentioned, the darker red areas are higher levels of potential sequestration. So as we zoom in and it draws, you can see the various different reds. So in this case, the darkest reds are going to be due to forest areas, and the lighter colors are going to be due to other classes where the lightest is developed. So the interesting thing here is this little layers button allows us to compare. So that's the 2010. Let's turn on the 1985. And when we give it a chance to draw here, and we can look over time. I'm not sure where I zoomed by accident here. I just picked this place. You can see from 1985 to 2010, there's less of the dark red and more of the lighter colors, indicating those land conversions and their impact on the carbon sequestration. Also in this map is the change here at the top. So when we turn that on, those values, it looks a little pixely here. That's the nature of land cover. The purple are areas of lost ability for carbon sequestration, and the greens are increased. And if we look at the maps a little bit, just to compare, let's just turn on the land cover. We can see that those purple areas are generally developed. Now you're looking at red here to throw a lot of colors at you. And the green areas are areas like right here, for instance, are areas of turf and grass. So this was a conversion probably from a field or grassland to turf and grass. So that actually showed an increased ability. So I'm not going to spend more time on these maps, just to wanted to let you know that they are available and they are up there, and they are accompanied by a few explanatory web pages that include some of the information from Linda's work, and this is a work in progress, so they will continue to grow. Let me go back to my slides here. Here is a slide about the website itself. That is the link. You can also link to it from the CT Eco homepage. So I encourage you to check this out, especially over time as we continue to fill in the information that Linda has presented today. Okay, and thank you for tuning in. Let me see if we have any more questions. Or if you have any questions, comments, or anything interesting, please let us know, and we'll stay on the line for a few more minutes. Okay, those are our email addresses. If you have any other comments or thoughts, please send them along, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you.